Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my China or Shanghai sprint race post-race reaction. What was your thoughts on this sprint race? I thought it was decent for a sprint race. I'm not very big on sprint races, but this one turned out to be fairly decent. We had some tension on who was actually going to be the finisher for this, the winner of this sprint race. You know, we had Hamilton getting out front, but Max Verstappen really putting a lot of pressure on him early on. And that kind of gave you the little bit of tension that you needed to keep yourself interested. And you had a little bit of other action going around in the background. So what was your thoughts on this sprint race? I'm going to start off the back of the pack and work my way forward like normal, giving you my thoughts on each driver as they go through and how they finished the sprint race, and see if they had any issues or anything else that I knew about during this time. So to start us off with, we're going to have Jack Doohan, who started in 16th, not bad, but not the greatest for him. He was still behind his teammate quite a bit and ended up in that 20th position after, that spin and collision at the end. He did lose 2 spaces at the very first lap, which kind of hurt him a little bit in that running. He did pass Nico Hülkenberg on lap 18 for that 18th position, and then he hit Bortoleto on that last lap, spinning both cars and earning himself a 10-second penalty. So not a very good job for Doohan at this sprint race. Hopefully he can get it back together for the actual GP race and really show what he can do in that Alpine, or else he will be out of a job in that driver position. I feel sorry for him, but that pressure is on, and that may be getting to him in this run as he's trying to show what he can do in these first opening sessions. Then we come to Nico Hülkenberg, who didn't do a whole lot either. He did start from the pit lane as that Stake F1 was making some changes, and so he didn't quite get to where he wanted to be on that qualifying. He did end up passing Doohan for 18th on lap 15, so he did make a little bit of progress, but otherwise he was kind of in the back of the pack, not doing a whole lot, really not giving that Stake F1 the oomph that it really needs. Whereas new teammate he's coming in and acting really strong, and so he's really outshining Hülkenberg in these couple of races that we've had. So hopefully he can get his act together in the GP race, figure out what the issues were on that Stake F1, and put a little bit more pressure on his teammate and the other cars in that back midfield. Then we come to his teammate, Gabriel Bortoleto. He had a good qualifying, making it up to 14th in that Stake F1, which seemed to be a little bit ahead of where most people think that car should be. So he's doing a really good job in that qualifying session. He did lose his spot at the first lap, so that kind of hurt him a little bit. Then he got tangled up in that mess at the very last, pushing him back down into that 18th position. Expect to see a little bit more in that GP race from him and see if he can, bring himself back up to the top and really see what he can do in that Stake F1 and possibly outshine Hülkenberg again in the GP race. So we'll have to wait and see. Then we come to Sainz, who ended up starting in 13th position, so a decent run for that Williams, but still behind his teammate on that qualifying session. He did end up having some kind of issues where he had to pit on lap 12, which pushed him back and ended up having a 20-second gap from being at the very back, but he worked his way back into that 17th position. And that course kind of helped him out a little bit with that spin very last lap when Doohan kind of came in and hit Gabriel as well. So that kind of helped him up in that ranking, but it was still interesting to see him coming back. So hopefully they can figure out what was going on with that Williams and be a little bit more on par with his teammate in the GP race. Then we get to Esteban Ocon, who qualified in 18th, made his way up to 16, gained a spot on the very start of the race, and then passed Bortoleto on lap 19 for that 16th position. And then we have his teammate, Oliver Bearman, who did a really good qualifying and made it all the way up to 12th, but then ended up dropping back down in the pack in that Haas, not doing quite as well as they were hoping to do, trying to figure out exactly what they need to do to fix that Haas so we have a little bit more speed on these circuits. They were kind of disappointed in that, thinking that they were a little bit farther ahead than they were. And so they're going to have to do some fixes, and hopefully that comes sooner than later. And we'll have to see how he does in the GP race and see if he can, get it back up there in the qualifying and maybe keep those positions instead of letting them drop, or possibly even gain a couple positions if he gets where he do that. Then we get to Liam Lawson, who had a horrible qualifying and qualified in 20th, so at the very back of the pack, made his way up to 14th. He did a lot of passing, but had bad qualifying. Pressure is on Liam Lawson in that Red Bull to try to act in. We see a lot of memes saying that he's another Checo, dropping back, or we had low expectations, and this is ridiculous where he's coming into the back of the pack. But at least he did shine a little bit on showing what he can do during the sprint race, doing quite a bit of passing during this sprint, where he passed Doohan on lap 5 for 18th, passed Ocon on lap 7 for 17th, passed Sainz on lap 11 for 15th, and then passed Behrman on lap 19 for that 14th position. So he kind of worked his way back up into that running. I'm not sure if it's enough to really make him forget how bad that qualifying session was, but we'll have to wait and see how that GP race follows through. Then we get Isaac Hydrar, which is doing fairly well, I think, as a new driver into the F1 series, qualifying in 15th, so not great, but not bad, and working his way up to that 13th position as well. So he did lose a spot on the first lap, so that wasn't good, but he ended up coming back, passing Borletto on lap 8 for 15th, passing Gasly on lap 10 for that 14th position, and then passing Sainz on lap 12, again, back to that 14th position. So he kind of worked his way back up, doing a little bit of passing here and there, kind of showing what he can do. I think he gets his confidence together. He will be a little bit closer to his teammate, and they can work some stuff out in that Racing Bull. So we'll have to see how that plays out throughout the season, see if he can get that confidence that he needs and get that little bit of learning that he needs to be more on par with his teammate. Then we get Pierre Gasly, who qualified poorly in 17th, but made his way up to 12th. He did gain 3 spots on that very first lap, so did really good on that first lap, getting around some of those slower drivers, putting himself in the right position to take advantage of all the first lap chaos. And then he came in and passed Isaac Hydrar on lap 10 for 14th, passed Sainz on lap 11 for 13th, and passed Behrman on lap 17 for 12th. So he made his way up through that ranking, kind of slowly but surely, but getting up into that, closer to those points, but way outside still. So he has a little bit to go in that, but he's getting more comfortable, and they probably can take that data back for that GP race and apply that and see if they can tweak that car to be a little bit more competitive. But we'll have to see how all the others tweak their cars as well from all the data that we've gotten in the sprint race, as we only had one practice session. And that kind of shows how things lined up, especially in the qualifying for the sprint. And then we have Alex Albon, who did a really good job qualifying in 9th, but fell back into that 11th spot. As I said, he did really good qualifying, but lost 2 spaces on that very first lap, and then kind of basically stayed there for the rest of the sprint race, keeping himself out of trouble, which is good, but not really gaining any ground. So we'll have to see how that Williams kind of plays out in the GP race. Right now, he's just outside of the GP points. So if he can get up there and possibly get that extra couple positions, get some extra more points for that Williams, it would be great to see. Of course, we have everybody else making some changes to their cars, I'm sure. So we'll have to see how that plays out in the GP race. Then we make our way to the top 10, where we have Fernando Alonso, who qualified in 11th, made it 1 position to that 10th position. So doing decently in that Aston Martin, but not quite where they need to be to get those points, especially in the sprint race. We'll see if that plays out in the GP race or not. He did, have a decent run, gained a spot on the very first lap, getting him into that position, but still kind of behind his teammate in that running. So we'll have to see how that plays out in the GP race and the future races this season. But right now, it seems like Stroll is a little bit better on par for the qualifying and during the race than his teammate is. Speaking of his teammate, he was just ahead of him in that 9th position, qualified 10th, so he gained 2 positions as he, did that first lap, and then kind of dropped back down into that 9th position and was sitting there for the rest of this race, doing decently. Sounded like he had some DRS issues as well during that sprint race, so we'll have to see if that plays out more, if that's a reoccurring issue or if that's something that was be able to fix and get a little bit more stable in that GP race and further in the season. Then we have Lando Norris, who had a bad qualifying session, starting off in 6th, kind of messed up on that last lap, ran off a little bit, dropped him back down into that 6th position. And you'd think he was going to come back during the sprint race, but then he really struggled on those tires, keeping him, a weird spot where he was. The question was that due to him running a little bit deep into that corner and losing 3 spots on that very first lap as well? Or if there's something else going on with that McLaren that can be looked at and figured out and fixed before the GP race. He did pass Stroll finally on lap 18 for that 8th position, gained him that extra point. And so getting a little bit of points kind of minimizes a little bit, but it's very minimal as he was in that very last position. And as I said, he struggled a lot with those tires. As you could hear, he had a big gap ahead of him for a long time with Stroll, and then was able to finally whittle that down throughout this sprint race to finally get past him. But if that happens in the GP race, he's probably going to be out of luck overall with those pit stops. So hopefully he can, and the McLaren can figure that out and get him back up closer to his teammate and not have those issues that we saw in this sprint race. Kimi Antonelli had a really clean race, did a decent job getting into that 7th position, not quite where his teammate George Russell was, but staying clean, not having any trouble, and just kind of riding it home in that spot. Kind of got stuck behind Yuki, so he couldn't really get where he could pass Yuki. So we'll have to see if that's going to be an issue in the future, or if in those dry conditions. It seemed like he did really well in the wet conditions, passing quite a few people last weekend. But we'll have to see how this plays out in the dry, or if this is just this circuit that he's having a little bit more struggling with, as this is probably a little bit newer track for him in this running this F1 car with more power, and how that plays out in this run. But a decent job for Kimi, especially for a rookie, kind of being back in that run. Then we have Yuki Tsunoda, who had a really good qualifying, getting up there in 8th position and gained a couple spots and making his way up to 6th overall. He did that on the very first lap and then kind of stayed there and was able to keep that position, kind of helping him out, helping his confidence out after, having that bad pit strategy last weekend, dropping him back out of the points. This will help him, get back into that rhythm and feel good about getting points for that Racing Bulls as they play out this season. So we'll have to wait and watch him fairly closely in this GP race to see if he can, handle that as well, or if they kind of mess up that strategy again for him. But it was a really good run for Yuki, kind of showing up the other people around him and showing that he can really be in that Red Bull for that primary team. Charles Leclerc, qualified in 4th, did a decent job there, but dropped back into that 5th position and really couldn't do anything in this sprint race. He kind of got stuck, lost that position on that first lap, and was basically there. I know he's complaining a lot, for turn 13, I believe it was, with his tires just not being able to turn or grip in that corner. So we'll have to see if they can pull up some data from him and Hamilton to see what they can do to tweak that Ferrari to get that a little bit better shape, to be closer to his teammate and be able in that front running positions. Then we have George Russell, who qualified in 5th and gained a spot into that 4th position over Charles Leclerc. He did a really good job in that first lap, gaining that position, and it was pretty good, strong, steady there. But then if you were looking at the gaps, he was still quite a far gap between him and those front running 3 cars. So there's still some work for the Mercedes to do in this running, but they'll figure it out. I think they seem to be fairly good at in the season developments. So we'll have to see how that plays out this season to see if they can get back up in that running and potentially get some more people going for that top position. Then we come to Max Verstappen, who did a really good job, I think, qualifying in that 2nd position. He did lose a position during this race, but I think overall that where that Red Bull is and compared to his driving, I think he did and got the most out of that Red Bull. I think he put a lot of pressure on Lewis early on, hoping that Lewis would make a mistake and that he could capitalize on that and get that first place and then get into some clean air and be able to run the race from his viewpoint instead of trying to be the chaser and trying to do that stuff. And I think that kind of hurt him a little bit in the sense that Lewis didn't make a mistake. And so that pressure kind of wore out his tires a little bit more. And that brought him back into the clutches of Oscar Piastri. So I think that's the reasoning, but I think Max did an excellent job. I don't think it's a fault of his own in that it was just a kind of a strategy play that kind of hurt them a little bit. But I think overall, I think it was worth that shot of being able to overtake Lewis for that front position, and instead they dropped back into that 3rd. And then we have Oscar Piastri, who qualified in 3rd, so a decent job for him. I think we were all expecting the McLarens to be 1 and 2 again, but there was a little bit tighter field for this. I don't think the McLarens got their setup quite right, and so they were kind of a little bit farther back in the field, having to work a little bit harder. And so we'll have to see if they can take all this data and apply it to the GP race and see if they can come out on top on the GP race. But decent job on qualifying, great race in the sprint race for this. He did a good job, kept his tires in decent conditions, whereas Max was kind of wearing them out, trying to put pressure, and then was eventually be able to overtake Max on lap 15 for that second position. So about 2/3 of the way through, took that second position away from Max and was able to stay there fairly easily the rest of those 5 laps, 4 to 5 laps. And then of course we have Lewis Hamilton, who did an excellent job through this, excellent qualifying, able to get him into that first position. Did a good job on the start, keeping Max behind him, having to swerve a little bit and block Max, keep him behind him in that first corner, and then keeping him in that bay, doing a good clean race, not making any mistakes, so didn't really wear his tires out too terribly. Keeping Max in that running, but not quite where he could really take advantage of Lewis, and then eventually just running away with the gap on that first position throughout this run. Look at that. He led the whole way. So in lap 5, he had a 1.02 second lead over Max. By lap 10, he had a 1.2 second lead over Max. By lap 15, he had a 2.5 second lead over Oscar. And by the end of the race on lap 19, he had a 6.8 second lead over Oscar. So he was well in hand on this sprint race. Really good job. Really excited for Lewis, especially in that Ferrari, coming back out, winning the sprint race, which Ferrari seems to have trouble doing. So we'll have to see how they can apply that to the GP race to see if they can get back up there and put pressure on that first position, or even take that first position again in the GP race. He also got the fastest lap for the sprint race, even though it doesn't count for anything. So really good job. Really excited for Lewis. I think he was doing a really good job. So what did this do to our driver standings? Well, we have Yuki Tsunoda overtaking Pierre Gasly for that 11th position, gaining those 3 points. And then we have Nico Hülkenberg, Charles Leclerc, and Lance Stroll dropping back, even though Charles did gain a couple of points, and Stroll got a couple points, but they're now tied with 8 points for that 8th position. Lewis Hamilton jumping them into that 7th position with 9 points, kind of tied with Oscar Piastri for those in that 9 points. So potentially 6th position as well for Lewis Hamilton. And then everything else kind of stays the same, even though we had Oscar not quite gained the ground that he wanted, so he's only ahead by a couple of points over Max Verstappen. And for the constructors standings, what did this do? Basically, Racing Bulls hopped over Alpine, gaining those 3 points. Kick Sauber, Aston Martin, and Williams dropped back a spot, where Ferrari was able to leapfrog them into that 4th spot now with 17 points. We kept the same running from the top 3, and just having that close range between Mercedes and the McLaren with just 1 point. So we'll have to wait and see how the GP race plays out to see if there are going to be any more changes in this lineup. So what is coming up next? Of course, we have the GP race. That's either later tonight or tomorrow, depending on what your time area is. I have it on tonight. It's going to be the GP race, and it's going to have the same length of 3.387 miles per lap, where we're going to have 56 laps for a total race distance of 189.559 miles. And currently the lap record holder is Michael Schumacher in 2004 with 1 minute 32.238 seconds. And of course, it was still introduced in 2004. And so we'll have to wait and see how that plays out in the GP race to see if someone can outdo that lap record and see who can come out on top with those tire strategies and the tire issues that they were having in the sprint race, and see if they can get on top of that and really have a dominant race, or if there's going to be some mix up and confusion in this GP race. And until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.